right, so why is compensation important? Well, here's some stats for you first. So salary obviously is at the front of mind for most people. It's a primary piece of information when you look at a role. And no matter how you say about, salary isn't that important for me, it's about fit. At the end of the day, if you're not paid enough for the role, it's not going to be appealing to you, no matter how much of a fit it is for you. So, being honest to ourselves, salary, it doesn't necessarily mean just the compensation around the money, but also everything else that's tied to compensation as well. However, only 30% of employees actually try to secure higher compensation. So, throughout the process of when you're called for an interview all the way to when you're being offered, a compensation number will often come out, but only 30% of people actually try to actually have that conversation of requesting for a high compensation because of whatever reason is there. And so Pew Research came out with a study that said, 38% of those who don't negotiate for compensation are not comfortable with doing that. And we'll go into reasons why in the next section about why we might not negotiate. But 85% who do negotiate end up with more. So those who are brave enough to kind of go into this, collaborative conversation will actually end up with more income and compensation at the end of the whole stretch. Now, Harvard research came up with a study that said really by 6 weeks into the role, only 13% of people in these new roles felt that they were still engaged by their jobs, right? So, you've got that honeymoon period going into a new role, new excitement about different reports and how the structure is going to look like and success looks like what. But after about 6 weeks, typically is when kind of the honeymoon phase goes away, and 13% of people really felt that they're still engaged with their jobs. And then at that point, you start settling into, things that anchor you still to that role, being excited by that role and the responsibilities is actually your compensation. So you start thinking, well, I mean, I'm getting compensated this much for the role, so I should be excited by that. And I don't know how many of you have had that experience, but I mean, I certainly have in my corporate career. By the way, before we continue, as always, we want this to be a very interactive conversation. Welcome Q&As, questions all throughout the conversation with Rainer and myself. And where it's appropriate, we'll just kind of insert questions into the conversation. It is meant to be more of a fireside chat. We have a lot of things to go through with you, but at the same time, want engagement from you as well. First off, I just want to ask, what is your experience with compensation negotiation, right? Has it been good, positive? Has it been negative? Has it been embarrassing? Just one word to describe what would that look like, type it into the Q&A. I would love to see, what the audience is thinking here. So why else is it important? Well, negotiate for your happiness, right? At the end of the day, as career coaches, Rainer and I we care also about your career management, not just the next role. So I always say that all of our clients will find roles because you guys are all experienced and very talented. But at the same time, the question is it a role that you're happy with, right? So you're negotiating in some sense for a sense of happiness, contentment there. Not that you're discontent or that you're not thankful, but at the same time, it is correlation to how much value you are by the company, et cetera. And that glow of that role will eventually wear off, as we said earlier, about the 13% who are disengaged for 6 weeks. Hopefully, you're not one of them. You're also negotiating for your long-term success, right? So the job that you're applying for isn't presumably your final job unless it is, right? But most people on the call probably are going to think about maybe 2 or 3 more roles before they retire. It's really setting up for that next job. So compensation, when you're coming in with a mindset of value, it actually has a very direct correlation. So when you're thinking about, well, I'm being paid this much as compensation, therefore my value is probably worth this much, and I have that confidence to bring into the next role, you're actually looking for long-term success when you're doing negotiation compensation. You're tailoring your strategy to the organization as well. So if the organization needs someone with high capability, high skills, and you recognize that, well, you could deliver that, right? You're telling them that you can, but at the same time, you want them to compensate you for that. So you're actually aligning yourself with the strategy organization when you do them a favor by saying, you've asked me to do 10 things, the job description at 6, and now those extra 4, I'm not getting compensated for that. So I don't even understand why the strategy involves that. So frame it in that position, right? That you're actually collaboratively working with them to build the organization. And then what are your goals, right? So when you're negotiating your compensation, you're also thinking about milestones in your career. And one of the things is really around, is that right level of compensation for you at that point in your career? So always remember that you're negotiating to optimize, right? And not to maximize compensation. And there's a really big difference there, even though intuitively it seems like you are maximizing how much you can get out of this, right? You're optimizing it because at the end of the day, if the company is paying you too much and either you're not delivering or their expectations are different, you're not hitting the milestones, they're not going to be happy with your performance. And at the end of the day, it's going to spoil your career. Even if you're still there 10 years later, it's not going to be a very successful journey going up. So you're optimizing that number. You're not maximizing that. It's not about squeezing out every last dollar that you can. And it's not about, kind of entitlement, but it's really about, what's the optimal input and output, right? Value in and then payment out. And you want both parties to feel like, you've gotten a fair deal, right? And you want to build up a positive relationship. So that conversation should never be forced, even though that initial conversation feels like it's forced, right? It is a very awkward conversation. It can be, but at the same time, you're throwing out there what you think is reasonable. And effective negotiation assumes that you aren't adversarial, right? So we're going to come back to that over and over again, where, if you think about a partnership conversation where you're kind of thinking about, what's a fair number? It's not intended to be kind of us versus them, right? It's got to be in partnership, talking about what exactly is the expectation of the role, how you can deliver that value, and therefore what's it's worth to the company. And keep in mind that most employers actually expect negotiations. If you are an employer or you've been on that side of the table, that may or may not be true to you, right? In some sense, maybe you'd be feeling that that's the maximum that you'll pay. But, if you're a senior executive at the level of most people on the call, there is that room there for interpreting what is value from what you bring into the role. So there's an expectation there. There's some conversation around that number. And it's an opportunity for you to point out that you understand the value of the role, that you see additional ways that you can add value to the role. So if they tell you that they would like to hire someone in for this kind of leadership, you can come back and say, I've done some research and I think that you need more. And I think this is the kind of leadership that I can provide. So it's an opportunity for you to understand and add value to the role and how your role can contribute to the bottom line. Right? That's the important part of it, is how can you make the money organization more productive, more efficient, more profitable. And your starting existing salary also sets the pace for compensation increase in the future. And this is a very important one because it's a lot harder to go from A to a very big B, even though you're performing well, than it is to kind of go midway between and kind of have a smaller jump, right? So it sets the pace for going forward, what that looks like as well. So let me just give you an example, very quick one, and we'll move on here. So assuming there's two employees, right? There's employee A, employee B. So employee A, they're both applying for the same roles. They're both equally qualified. Employee A negotiates a salary from 100K to 7.6, something around that 8% increase to $107,000. Okay, so you see that there. But employee B does not do that. They keep it at 100K. So if you look at the math, by year 65, if they're around the same age at 65 years old, employee B would have had to work 9 years longer to make as much as A does, right? Because simply by sort of normal calculation of what an increase reasonably looks like, that's kind of generally speaking what the stat looks like. You'd have to work 9 years longer to make as much, right? Of course, there's a lot of variables there, but as an example. Now, if you negotiate the salary at 8%, right, if employee A did that, then B would have to work 18 years or 19 years longer just to get to that salary number by year 65 or age 65. And if you increase it even just by 1 more percent, right, you'd have to work about 50 years longer. So again, just an incremental, assumption around like increases, but that kind of generally speaking shows you a little bit of the math, right? Where you're setting the pace for kind of the rest of your career when you're negotiating. So keep that in mind, that's a real kind of, a shocker of a number there, but if you kind of do the math, it works out around that. Okay, so what stops us from negotiating? I'd love to hear from the audience as well. What stops you from negotiating? What's been your experience? And yeah, 1 or 2 words would be wonderful. So there's 3 things that I put down here. Number 1 is we overlook what we truly value in life. So there's this thing called vividness bias, where we have a tendency to focus too closely on vivid information and we overlook dull but equally valuable information. So what that means is we're so closed in our world about what's important that we forget that there's actually much bigger things that are valuable to the company. So we kind of think, well, what's important to me probably isn't very valuable to anyone else, so I'm not going to base my value on those things, right? But you're creating a scoring system for yourself to get a better sense of what you value. So in some cases, it's sort of a personal decision, some value systems or variables. In some cases, it's actually very impactful to the company. So what you can do is create for yourself a scoring system, and it allows you to weigh different issues about what you value in your life to determine how much you value each one and compare them more accurately. And taking it one step further, you can compare that with the job description and kind of what's been described as far as the roles and responsibilities in that particular piece or that role. And a good scoring system is complete, it's measurable, it's useful, and it kind of gives a really good balanced view of what value looks like both to you and bigger pieces that might seem mundane or dull to you, but are important to the company as well. Okay, so we kind of tend to do that sometimes. Sometimes we get in our own way, and this is sort of imposter syndrome based kind of bias. And we have somewhat of a self-destructive tendency sometimes to hold back in our job negotiations. And for many people that you've met who are overconfident, there are tons of more people that they're lacking in confidence, and they shouldn't be. We might feel weird about asking for a significant pay raise because there might be a bit of imposter syndrome, right? Is that really what I'm worth? And if I ask for that, I can't, they always say that, when you're setting up a business, how much should you charge for a product? Well, it's what number you can throw out without laughing, right? So what number can you throw out about your compensation without feeling like you're kind of like, it's a bit of a joke. But there's a bit of imposter syndrome that you're undermining yourself and what your value is and not asking for more because of that. So by bargaining ourselves down, it starts to self-doubt, right? We have that cycle of like, well, this seems like a fair compensation now that I think about it, but again, think about the value that we bring, and we don't get in our own way of making that step to negotiate. And then expectations of if you get paid higher, there's going to be more expectations of you in that role. So part of the question we ask ourselves is actually, can we deliver on that, right? Can we deliver on that extra 50 grand or 100 grand on the compensation there? So we get in our own way so we don't negotiate. The last thing I would say is that we fail to recognize our relative bargaining power. So we lack confidence to ask for the right amount, right? Similar to the previous point there. But what is the right amount? And that's the tough question that Rainer will walk us through about how do you prepare your mindset for a fair compensation conversation. The savvy job seekers remember that to treat negotiation as a beginning of a long-term relationship, and that's part of the collaborative conversation. All right, so we're going to move on to the next section here, and I'll pass it over to Rainer.
Wonderful. I would like to start with a simple question. What mindset are you bringing to negotiations? And I will be sharing with you what worked well for my clients over the past 2 decades. And this is only reflective of myself and my clients. And I hope it's going to be exciting and useful for you. So I see 3 possible options. There are executives with no mindsets who are drifting. The majority, the overwhelming majority I see is one among the many mindsets. And the last category in which I want every one of you to be in is the champion mindset, because everyone wants to win, don't we? And I see that the negotiation process is a game. However, most executives take it too serious. They're too much attached to the outcome. And this can actually spoil the broth. What makes you irresistibly attractive is if you take it light and playful. And another point that is important is I want you to be a risk taker, be fearless and courageous to fight for what you stand for in the world. Remember, getting executive offers is most of the time about overcoming organizational inertia, breaking through the status quo, and you don't simply make it by being a yes sayer to everything. Being confident in yourself and your own self-worth is an issue. Lack of confidence is the number 1 issue for getting less in compensation negotiations. And people under-earn because they undervalue themselves. And this is closely tied to the issue of knowing your worth. So let me talk about knowing your worth. Are you valuing your contribution to your company? If so, you should define your worth as a function of your contribution to your company. So fair compensation is a matter of what is the size, what is the level of your success that you can create for them. And I give you an example. I came across one executive who was searching for a couple of months, and he had applied for over 100 companies and achieved nothing. He was board member at around $400,000, and one of his strategies was to lower his compensation. He had already self-doubts and was as low as $150,000. One lesson I can share with you, and that is a mistake a lot of executives are doing, lowering your compensation is one of the fastest ways to make you unattractive. I addressed the self-doubts issue, I addressed the confidence issues, restored the wealth and self-worth, and after 4 months, the executive was having in his hand a $500,000 offer. He was a first-time CEO in his career at the age of 63. Wow. This is what worth and strong confidence can do for yourself. Be sensitive to the effects a downside economy can have on your future employer. We are close to a hard landing recession in the United States quite soon. Other parts of the world are already in a recession. And what are you doing in such scenarios? The company is probably facing the loss of some important markets or some strategic clients. And how can you still negotiate and get what you want while at the same time, let's say, not driving yourself out of the recruitment part? One way is to look at the long-term cash compensation and say to the opposite side that you are expecting a generous long-term cash compensation, and to slice this into 3 bundles, which are paid out yearly, one is next year and the following. That can be spiced up with a generous sign-on bonus, or combined with other possible perks such as housing or a car paid by the company. Yeah. Simeon, please continue. Switch. So here the key question is, how can we make you a winning case? Would you hire yourself? What is a persuasive argument to get the decision maker say, yes, we want to hire you? The key is the value. Value is king, especially in the hidden job market. So know your value, focus on your value. The general rule is that excellent rewards go to those providing excellent performance. Average rewards go to people with average performance. And under average rewards or unemployment goes to the people below. And value is the one thing that tells people what do they get from you after hiring you. Most executives fall into the trap believing it is a matter and a function of your experience, and you have usually LinkedIn profiles or resumes starting with, I have 20 years or maybe 25 or 30 years of experience. In these quickly changing markets, experience may be rendered useless overnight. For example, commercial experience in Eastern Europe. Who is interested in investing in Eastern Europe these days? Having said this, the second track is to understand value is in the eye of the beholder. Some executives get really angry when they look at jobs and job descriptions for which they have applied, and they confess, I could take a list and almost tick any of the boxes. I've never heard from the company. What on earth happened? Well, from your perspective, maybe you look like Prince Charming, but that is irrelevant. What matters here is really to what extent does the hiring organization see value in what you're proposing to them? And the key instrument there is to have a strong, unique value proposition. The question is what problems matter to them and how are you uniquely positioned to solve them? Let me give you one example. Fidelity, I was negotiating a $1 million offer with Fidelity. The problem they were facing was that they were about to lose their license to operate because financial regulations were stipulating that they needed to have lawyers, counsels. And my candidate was from Merrill Lynch, but 1 million was a killer amount. And at this particular moment, the market for lawyers was virtually empty, and all companies were hiring the same category. And so they had a big problem, which was the license to operate. And this package was even higher than this of the chief executive officer. So depending on your value, depending on whether you're really able to solve their problem, and not only just well, but at excellent levels, they're willing to pay a lot to get the right leaders on board. Let me you. The best way.
Let me just, if you don't mind, I really love what you just said there, because it really comes down to, is the problem that they have to solve worth the amount that you're asking for, right? So if you're negotiating for $1 million, they're asking themselves, well, what is our problem that we have to solve? And then therefore, is it worth $1 million? Because you said that you could solve that. I think one of the tactics that we do talk about a lot is we have to define for them what their value is, right? What is valuable for them. Sometimes, the recruiter may not even know that, right? Anyway, keep going. That's great. It's a great point.